the 3 question series. And what I've learned is you can't and you wouldn't want to ask the same 3 questions of every leader that you get privileged to interview. So, in my quest to try and make it much more applicable, because Rabbi Goldson is, after all, the ethics ninja, we're going to take a slightly different tact because he and I both feel strongly about this, but he is definitely the expert. So, welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kimi. I'm absolutely delighted.
Now, ethics in leadership is one of those topics that everybody purports to feel very strongly should be discussed. And yet, it's been a long, slow slog to try and get people actually discussing it as much as we would like. So, what do you think has stood in the way of leaders being willing to get the scar tissue to strengthen their ethical outlook?
I think there are two components here. And then the first is the definition of leadership. Those of us who've raised children know that they come home, they have homework, they often ask for our help. And we very quickly find it's much easier to do their homework for them than to help them do it themselves. And my wife used to joke, "Oh, Mrs. Smith is doing very well in fourth grade," because it was clear that she was doing her son's homework. And my definition of a leader is someone who empowers and enables others to fulfill their distinct, singular, unique potential in a way that benefits the world. And I know that some have said that the best CEO does nothing
Oh,
because the job of the CEO, I mean, Jim Collins expresses this beautifully in Good to Great. He says the job of the leader is to get the right people on the bus and get them in the right seats. And then leave them alone. Let them do their jobs. Micromanaging, this really leads into the second problem, which is one of trust. That
mm,
I want my people to trust me, but I have to be willing to trust them. And if I micromanage, we all know micromanaging doesn't work. So why do we do it? Because we don't trust those around us to do it themselves. And that's all a matter of culture. You have to, that's why ethics is so fundamental to success, because ethics means having an awareness of how my actions impact those around me. And that's not just in individual interactions, that's the way I carry myself. It's, am I projecting the values through my behavior, not just my words? Um, I just, I've been in negotiation over a big training project, I'm on the brink of walking away from it because I don't believe the person who wants to hire me. I don't sense that he trusts me. And even worse,
mm,
I don't think that he trusts the people that he wants me to help. He doesn't seem to believe in
mm.
his own people. And if he doesn't, there's no way this is going to work. So there's that element of trust. And then if I can add one more component in there, it's we're so focused on the short-term gains that we don't recognize how we sabotage our long-term goals. If we're trying to hit benchmarks, if we're trying to show profits, well, what happens if you have to do the, sort of, if you have to play that long game, or what we call the infinite game? I have a purpose that I'm trying to fulfill. I have an ideal I'm trying to achieve. And being financially successful, making money, that's part of that, but it's not integral. It's more of a side part, an ancillary part. And so we sabotage our own success because we're so focused on, I don't want to make a mistake because I'll look bad. I don't want to admit I'm wrong because people will question me. I don't want to be vulnerable because people will take advantage of me.
Mhm.
And then the whole ethics foundation breaks down, the trust breaks down, and ultimately I'm not going to succeed and my enterprise is not going to succeed.
And I think that part of that is that while many organizations spend a lot of time, and in some cases, and I suspect with your background, you've probably been in or facilitated groups that are trying to figure out what is our mission, what is our vision. And they spend all this time doing that. And that's supposed to be their guiding light, their North Star, if you will. But after a while, people like you and me, who we tend to follow our clients' progress, even after we're no longer on engagement with them. And we start to get the feeling, to your point, that somewhere along the line, we should have just said that your mission is to create the biggest positive impression on the street and the financial community on a quarterly basis every quarter, because that's what they are actually doing. So they have managed to disconnect their ethics and behavior from the objective they were trying to achieve. And the issue about trust is huge. I mean, so if you think about it, if you had to narrow it down, there are specific challenges that seem to have gotten more obvious during the past now 18 months. Oh my goodness, it's been a while. During the past time as the world has responded to the pandemic. And we've learned a lot, I think, by both behavior and observation of other leaders about the challenges that we're trying to overcome. What are the challenges that you see could actually remain as we get out of the pandemic mindset and operational guidelines and start returning to an environment where we are going to be face to face?
Um, what I've heard being discussed is the inevitability of a hybrid world that we're going to be having doing both of what we've been doing. We're going to have live because we need that. We're going to keep the virtual because there are tremendous advantages to that. But this is going to be a real challenge because yeah, human beings are lousy multitaskers.
It's
We,
built into us to be lousy. I mean, that our
yeah,
brains are wired that way.
exactly, exactly. And yet we have this sort of urgency, this sense of urgency. We have to multitask because there's just so much to do.
Mhm.
And all the studies prove it doesn't work. It's actually counterproductive. When you do two jobs, each one takes you 4 times as long. So you're cutting your productivity in half. But we keep doing it because we just feel this sense of urgency. And if you go to a hybrid model, that means that all our interactions are going to be pulled into two different worlds. And if I'm a speaker speaking to a live audience, I'm focused on my live audience. Now I'm going to have to think, well, there's this virtual audience out there, and I have to pay attention to them. But when I do that, then I lose my connection with the live audience. It's going to be a real challenge for us. And I don't really know if there's a good solution out there because it really does speak to the heart of, as you said, we're wired to focus in and not to spread ourselves thinly. So this is going to be something we're going to have to deal with, and I don't know exactly how we're going to deal with
One of the things that you mentioned, I think, is why it articulates the why I wanted to ask you that question. If leaders are truly working towards diversity, inclusion, and equality, well, those aren't just things that speak to gender or cultural background or religious beliefs. It also speaks to your ethical stand on how you're going to treat everyone on your team in a way that demonstrates to them that they are important. whether they're in your physical room or in your virtual room. And I think that's going to be highly, highly fraught with failures, the likes of which can create a culture that will actually be incredibly toxic in such a subtle and insidious way that we didn't see it coming until it happened. And it also means we can't actually figure out how we managed to do it. So, what would you suggest in order to try to be truer to your ethics as an inclusive leader and at the same time adapt to the fact that some of the people that you're speaking with are thousands of miles away, if not continents away? Um,
Well,
Please, wisdom.
if I had a good answer for that, I could really raise my fees. Uh, it's interesting. I wrote an article about this at the beginning of COVID, that technology is a tremendous tool. I mean, we are so blessed. I mean, just imagine if we didn't have Zoom when COVID came around, how isolated we would be. And so, for all the talk about Zoom fatigue, and I get it, we really need to be appreciative. And that appreciation, of course, is the foundation of so much that has to do with attitude, has to do with outlook, has to do with the culture that we create for ourselves and around ourselves. But to your point, in the problem with the technology is the distance, that sense of being disconnected. But even before we get to that, before COVID came, we were disconnected. And the irony is that in the age of connectivity, we're actually more separated than we've ever been, because we have become so superficial in our interactions. And that's spilled over into our in-person relationships. We became more superficial when we're face to face. And it was easier to be superficial face to face because I could feel that we could feel our presence, and therefore we didn't have to interact in a way that had real substance to it. And the irony of COVID is that it created the situation in which the affliction becomes the cure.
Oh my goodness.
Because through Zoom,
Mhm.
we now had to compensate for that sense of distance by having more substantive interactions. I mean, I really feel blessed. I met you on a Zoom networking program,
We did. We
which
did.
was
It's
extremely well designed. I found that program more worthwhile than any in-person networking program I had ever been to. It was very well designed. And it really has to do with us making the effort. I want to feel connected to people. And I become connected to people all over the world. I mean, Azerbaijan and South Africa and Sweden. I mean, it's really extraordinary. And if we remind ourselves not to default to the superficial, but to have substantive conversations like this one, have the willingness to listen to them. I was asking on another podcast, what website do I go to? What's my go-to website? And I thought about it, and I was almost embarrassed to say the answer, which was YouTube.
ah,
Because while there is so much junk,
oh, that's such a kind word.
it is, you know, you know, brain candy, whatever. But there is so much that's worthwhile if we make the effort to seek it out. I mean, 2 and 3 hour long interviews with really thoughtful people talking about really important things. Uh, you can barely put the cup to your lips and to drink from it. There's so much out there. But the potential that technology offers us to go deeper, to go wider, to find new ways of stimulating our own thinking. I mean, back to your point of diversity and inclusion, um, the value of diversity is not checking boxes. It's exposing ourselves to different points of view, to different ways of thinking.
Mhm.
And some of them we may not respect. I mean, I just had somebody, an online connection, sent me to give me three names of people to look up. Two of them, I couldn't figure how she could possibly put these two people together because one I found really inspiring, and the other one got my blood boiling.
Oh, oh,
But at least now I'm familiar with them.
mhm,
At least I had the opportunity to
mhm.
listen, to try to understand, to form what I hope is a relatively objective and enlightened opinion.
Yes.
And being exposed to the way different people think, where they're coming from, we understand them better. We understand ourselves better because we understand them better.
And it broadens our boundaries, I like to say, because most of us do, whether we want to admit it or not. We think of ourselves as open minded, but there are definitely boundaries past which we do not comfortably or at all trespass. And
Yeah,
that
we like to say
opens
that
those boundaries a little bit.
yeah, we like to say you can be so open minded that your brains fall out.
I'm definitely borrowing that. I
Yeah, well, I
definitely
didn't make it
borrowing
up, so
that.
don't quote me. But it's if I knew where it came from, I would quote the source. Um, but you're the boundaries. I mean, I where's my soapbox? I could get up and talk about boundaries from here now until next week. I mean, King Solomon says, "Respect the boundaries of eternity that were set in place by your ancestors." Um,
Mhm.
there's a reason why traditions have gone on and on and on and on for generations. And don't be so quick to throw them out just because there are new shiny objects in the room. Uh, on the other hand, if you're too rigid, then those boundaries become a prison
Yes.
and you don't let anything in and you can't go out. And so there's always this tension. I mean, the right and the left. I mean, what conservatism and liberalism mean today is not what the terms are meant to mean,
It's
and
not
they're
at
not
all how I
incompatible.
understood them. Yeah, it's not at
Yeah,
all how I understood them when I was growing up and getting to the point of maturity where we were formulating our own ideas about what was going to work for us as individuals and what maybe not so much.
you need a healthy interplay, and that's what technology. That's what technology gives us in a way that we never had before, as long as we use it responsibly.
Oh dear, responsibly? I'm
I know that's a
I'm only half
microaggression. I know.
kidding. Yeah, I'm only half kidding. One of the things that you spoke to, I think, is particularly important for those of us who have a mission to deliver a message that does broaden boundaries, as yours does. And I'm going to ask you about that in a minute because I think it's so important. We are able to reach wider audiences, and that is wonderful. We're able to reach people, as you said, completely internationally. And the last time I spoke to my colleagues in Luxembourg before this, I had to fly a number of hours and deal with rather dreadful airplane food in order to have those conversations. But the ease does not mean that we lose the responsibility for making them truly conversations. And one of my favorite questions was, "Oh my, when you said that, I just realized how many times in the course of a day before this that I would ask somebody how they were, and 5 seconds after they finished answering, I couldn't have told you what they said." And I said, "Really? Then why did you ask?"
We don't really want an answer, do we?
I think for most of us, what we want is a socially acceptably edited response. Somebody's going through something dreadful. Instead of saying, "Oh, well, you would not believe what so and so said and what happened to my car, and I don't know why, but all my windows are leaking," they might want to say, "Well, I've had better days." You know, that is truthful enough that it gives you as an individual who asked that question a little bit of understanding about how maybe for today, please give me just a little grace because I've had better days. Mm.
Yeah, and it's really, I think you're absolutely on the point here that we're conflicted because we want to feel connected and we want others to feel like we care, and we do care, but we're so overloaded, we just don't have time to care too much,
Sadly.
which is, you know,
Mm.
worth thinking about.
I wanted to ask you because, as you know, my focus is all about how technical professionals become stronger and better leaders. And ethics is woven into that so much. And I confess, I haven't yet gotten too far deeply into grappling with the gray. Can you tell me what message you think in your book is particularly resonant with leaders, even if these people don't have the official title of leaders, but they are fulfilling the leadership role? What is the message out of grappling with the gray that you think is particularly relevant to them?
I just like the way you phrase that because I think we should all think of ourselves as leaders
Mhm.
because we can all have an impact on those around us. And I know this is a digression, but it's a story that Simon Sinek tells that I just love. He and a friend were walking down the street talking, and a few yards in front of them, a young man had a rip had opened up in his backpack, and stuff was falling out. Papers were falling out, and he didn't realize it. So Simon Sinek and his friend, as they're talking, without breaking their conversation, just start reaching down and picking this stuff up and gathering it. And they catch up with him and say, "Excuse us, you better watch out for your backpack. Here's your stuff. We saw it." Oh, he was very grateful.
Mhm.
All right, nice. At the next signal, they stopped. And a young man said, "Hey, I saw what you did for that guy back there. That was cool." And say, why would somebody be impressed as if it was so unusual that somebody would do such a thing?
That somebody would do what is simply the right thing to do.
Right. But now this person's going to think differently. When he sees someone in need, he's more likely to take the initiative to reach out. So that's the sense in which we are all leaders. And now please remind me what the question was so I can come back and answer it.
I You and I have spoken both one-on-one and in crowds of people, and I suspect that there is a particular lesson in grappling with the gray, which, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't gotten it, I would strongly advise you get it. And if you're worried about your teenage kids, might not be a bad idea to initiate a conversation based on what he's saying. But I'd like you to tell me, is there a particular idea or thought that you think is relevant to leaders in this situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a quote I used actually in a previous book. It's from a French philosopher. I believe his name is Joseph Joubert, maybe.
Well, your
um,
French is a great deal better than mine would
well,
have
that
been.
says more about you than it does about me. But he said it's better to debate an issue without resolving it than to resolve it without debating it.
I am definitely going to have to look that one up and learn how to pronounce that name.
Yeah, and I can find that for you. But the point is this: ethics requires us to see the whole picture, or as much of the picture as we can, before making a decision. And that's where I think we are really challenged today, because we have become so ideological, we have become so partisan, we've become so entrenched in our little enclaves of groupthink that not only don't we try to understand the other side, we are discouraged from trying to understand the other side. And when that happens, there really is nowhere to go. Now, I always point to the example of the High Court of Sages 2,000 years ago. And whenever they had to discuss a point of Jewish law, the first person to speak was always the most junior member of the court. Because if the head of the court spoke first, well, I'm going to be very intimidated to argue with the head of the court. But if the most junior member speaks first, I have no problem if I have a different way of looking at things. And then they would work up the line to seniority. And it's such a compelling strategy for a leader to encourage discussion, to encourage debate, to encourage challenging. Quiz question, real quick. What's the first recorded instance in history of advice to a CEO?
Good heavens, I have no idea. There's so much of it out there.
So you have to go all the way back to in the beginning. When God says, let us make man in our image, who's he talking to? He's talking to his heavenly court. Why is he asking them? Why is he including them? He is God.
Well, I mean,
And what it tells us is that the person in charge should include his or her team, underlings, even if I've already made up my mind, even if I'm 100% sure, for two reasons. One, it makes them feel valued. It makes them, it shows them that I'm willing to listen to them. But second, if I'm not God, and most of us aren't, maybe I've missed something. Maybe there's a perspective I haven't considered. Maybe there's a point of view that is going to refine or shift or refute the course of action that I've already made up my mind. So that willingness to encourage discussion, debate, what we call constructive disagreement, that is priceless. Because, we say the answer is almost always in the room. If you have a bunch of bright people together, there are going to be all kinds of good ideas out there. If you create a culture where everyone feels free to experiment, to propose, to suggest, maybe this is half-baked, but let's throw it out there and see if there's something in it that we can take away that will benefit us all together. It's a mindset, it's a willingness, and it shows respect.
Which is one of the principles of ethical treatment of others that I find sometimes a little more difficult to find than I would definitely like it to. I think there's another point though to what you're saying, which is I am 100% certain at this moment, I am absolutely sure this is the best course of action. And I am asking you, is there any reason that I should back that down from 100%? Is there anything that I can do, should do, that might take that 100% down? Well, it might not take it down much, but let's face it, business is about implementation. And so that magnificent idea is still going to have to be implemented. Let's try to tweak it a little bit, give it a little bit of the benefit of improvement, as early as possible. And right now, you've just decided, and we're, by and large, we're agreeing, and we could do this also. And now, before we've sent it out to the troops and said, this, by the way, is the new operating procedure, that's the best time, but not the only time, but the best time, to get the dissenting opinion and to get the have you thought of those kinds of things.
Sure.
You
I was
know,
listening to a great interview with founder of Netflix,
oh,
and he said that their original idea was to ship out cassette tapes. Anybody out there old enough to remember VHS? Is that what they call it? Video
I'm
cassette
not
tapes.
answering that.
And they, they quickly realized that would be way too expensive. Well,
Mhm.
there was this new technology that was just starting to filter into the market called DVDs.
Ah, yeah.
And so, do you think we could send a DVD through the mail? Well, they couldn't get their hands on a DVD at that point. But it looks a whole lot like a CD, and we have one of those. So they put it in an envelope and they mailed it to themselves
Mhm.
to discover, let's first see if this works before we start building a whole business around
Mm.
it. And this is his advice to people. Everybody says there are no bad ideas. He says there are no good ideas because every
Unless
idea needs
we prove
refinement.
it.
Yet, right? Yet,
Right.
exactly, exactly. And so when you've got a good idea, find a way of implementing it as an experiment before you go all in. And that's
Little
where, as
bitty
you said,
test groups.
yeah, that's where it's a lot easier to fix problems before they become part of the infrastructure.
Oh, or before you've unwittingly and completely without malice cracked or fractured a culture that was going to higher performing and managed to crack it into pieces and then bring it back down again. And neither one of those scenarios is going to ever be terribly easy to fix.
Yeah. And as you said, you can be 100% certain and still be 100% wrong.
Yes,
I think
well,
many of us have had that experience or at least witnessed it.
I was going to say I just had scar tissue trigger. Um, I could I could carry a conversation with you forever, but I know that your time is precious and I wanted to respect it. So I just have one more question.
Please.
At this point in our lives, we have learned a great deal and our focus has shifted a great deal. If you could go back to the person you were, say when you pick a number of years, a significant number of years back, and you could meet yourself for coffee in just 5 minutes, what would you say to that young man?
Well, I think the caveat has to be I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have listened to myself.
There is that. What would be so important that you try anyway?
George Bernard Shaw said youth is wasted on the young. And
Oh, in so many ways.
when you say there's no substitute for experience, there's really no point in saying it because once you have the experience, you don't need to hear it. And before you have the experience, you're not going to understand it. So, um, but I would say, yeah, Stephen Covey I think it's the seventh habit is sharpen your axe. And
Sharpen your saw, yes.
it's such a simple concept that you want to get right to work, right? So you don't want to waste time sharpening the
Mm.
axe when you could use that time cutting down the tree. Except it's going to take you 3 times as long to cut down the tree with a blunt axe. So that prep time is not wasted time. It's intrinsic to the job, and this is something that I have suffered from my entire life. Uh, I would phrase it a little differently in this context. I would say, lay your foundations.
Yeah.
because I'm very creative. I love ideas. Um, but I'm a very slow reader. I have a mild reading disability, which I didn't know about when I decided to get my degree in English. Um,
Oh my.
but in the lower division survey classes, I got C's.
Hmm.
In the upper division classes, I got A's
Hmm.
because when we could focus in on less material, I could go deep and thoughtful and just I was in my element. But trying to skim through hundreds, thousands of pages, it was a challenge. So what I ended up doing was taking shortcuts. I didn't read them. I couldn't even make it through the Cliff Notes very often. And had history too. I love history. Unfortunately, a lot of it isn't written in a way that's that compelling. Now that you
Oh
can find
gosh.
more of it,
No.
some of it is, but it was so hard to slog through that. So what I ended up doing, I mean, I was a master. The history teacher would give us a paragraph, some quote from history, and he gives a question, and I could reframe in that question and just from what was on the page. I mean, I could compose this eloquent essay that would get me A's and B's without having done the hard work of actually learning the material, so I knew what I was talking about. And it's very tempting and to well, let's skip over the boring parts or the demanding parts of gathering our data, of building our skills, of laying those foundations or sharpening the axe, whatever metaphor works for
Mhm.
you. And I suffer from it today. I still feel that I handicapped myself by not doing a lot of the
Wow.
hard work because it was just so much more stimulating to jump to the creative part.
This idea.
Yeah, let's talk about ideas. But ideas are only as good as the facts they're built on, or as Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts, which is something that I think you could probably get arrested for saying today. Uh,
Sadly.
yeah, but that that
Mm.
would that would be the message. Have the patience and the discipline to do the hard work that comes first, because the creative part is going to be so much more rich and honest later on.
And it for young people, I think it's particularly important. As a singer, I was incensed with my voice. You're making me do scales? Scales? Really? Yes, really. And along the way, you learn how to breathe, and along the way, you learn how to phrase, but mostly you need to master the ultimate basics. And I look back at those years and I think, how did I not notice that that was teaching me so much more than what I was hearing? Thank you so much, Jonathan. Always a pleasure to have a conversation with you. And thank you for the wisdom that you've shared with the people who are going to be viewing this and hearing this. It is incredibly an honor to have you featured.
It's a pleasure, Kimi. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you again in our library.